You ruin everything, he spat across the table, his voice low but sharp enough to slice through the hush of the restaurant. It was the 11th time he'd said something like that this year, but the first time it didn't make me shrink. I stared at the flickering candle between us, the wax pooling like the years I'd wasted trying to please him. My name is Julia Carter, and this was supposed to be our 10th wedding anniversary. A night to remember, he'd promised. And it was. Just not the way he'd meant. I looked up, studying his face the way you might look at a stranger on a bus. He was handsome once, when his eyes still held curiosity instead of contempt. Now, they were dull and cold. The waiter approached with a soft smile, trying to pretend he hadn't heard. My husband, no, not for much longer, dismissed him with an impatient flick of his hand. "We're fine," he snapped. His gaze darted around, anxious someone might be watching. He cared so much about appearances, about being the successful husband with the perfect wife. I'd given him that image for too long. The truth was, I'd spent years collecting his insults like bruises I hid beneath my clothes. But something had changed this past winter when I'd woken up one morning and realized I felt nothing but relief at the thought of never hearing his voice again. It wasn't rage or heartbreak anymore, just emptiness. And emptiness, I'd learned, was freedom waiting to be named. He lifted his wine glass and swirled it lazily. "You know, Julia, if you weren't so damn controlling, maybe we'd be happy. Maybe you wouldn't suffocate everything you touch." I watched the candlelight dance across the rim of his glass, my heart as still as the linen napkin in my lap. I wondered how many more dinners I would have sat through, how many more carefully worded put-downs I would have swallowed if not for one small conversation months ago. His mother, Eleanor, had called me out of the blue. She never interfered, never took sides, but her voice was gentle that day. She'd said, "You don't deserve to be the only one trying." She didn't have to say more. I understood. I slipped my hand into my purse and felt the smooth corner of the envelope waiting there. My fingers rested on it like it was a secret talisman. I'd rehearsed this moment in my mind so many times that it almost felt like muscle memory. He was still talking, complaining about something I'd forgotten to do, some tiny imperfection that proved, in his eyes, I was a failure. His words blurred into the clink of silverware and the low murmur of other couples around us. I glanced past him at the couples celebrating anniversaries with shy smiles and held hands, and I felt nothing but calm. He leaned back in his chair, smirking. "Say something, Julia, or are you just going to sit there looking pathetic?" My heart did not race. My palms did not sweat. Instead, a quiet finality settled into my bones. I took a slow breath and let it out, as if I were exhaling the last remnants of the life I no longer wanted. Then I met his eyes, really met them, and I smiled. It wasn't a bitter smile. It was the kind that says, "You can't touch me anymore." I straightened my spine, feeling taller than I ever had in his presence. My voice, when it came, was steady and clear. "No," I said softly. "I'm not going to sit here. Not anymore." I reached into my purse and drew out the envelope. The thick, cream-colored paper felt heavier than it had in the lawyer's office. I placed it carefully on the table, right beside his plate, and let my hand fall away. His smirk slipped for the first time in years. What is this?" he demanded, his voice rising. I folded my napkin, placed it beside my untouched plate, and looked him straight in the eye. "It's freedom," I said. "Happy anniversary." Around us, the other diners had gone silent. I didn't care. Let them watch. For the first time in a decade, I was done hiding, and when I turned my head slightly, I saw Eleanor sitting 2 tables away, her gaze locked on mine. She didn't look shocked. She looked ready. I used to believe love was something you earned by proving how much you could endure. Maybe it was how I was raised. My mother stayed with my father through everything, whispering to me that marriage is work while she dabbed makeup over her bruises. No one ever taught me the difference between commitment and self-destruction. When I met Andrew, he was charming. the kind of man who made everyone feel important. He'd tuck my hair behind my ear and tell me I was the most extraordinary woman he'd ever known. He could recite poetry, cook an elaborate meal, talk for hours about politics and art. The first year was golden, so perfect I ignored the little pricks of unease. But it didn't take long for his praise to sour into something sharper. I remember the first time he made me feel small. We were hosting a dinner party for his colleagues. I'd spent the whole day preparing, wanting everything to be perfect. But when he tasted the soup I'd worked so hard on, he set down his spoon with a sigh that made my stomach knot. "Julia," he said, voice low enough that only I could hear. "Why can't you just follow directions? You ruin things when you improvise." Everyone laughed a little too loudly at something across the table. I laughed too, pretending I hadn't just felt something in me crack. That's how it always started. Tiny criticisms dressed up as advice, a slight roll of his eyes when I spoke, a patronizing pat on my shoulder if I disagreed, and then the apologies that sounded more like accusations. "You're too sensitive." I was only joking. "You twist everything." I spent years trying to be easier, quieter, better. I learned to anticipate his moods, to smooth over his tantrums before they erupted. Every time I thought about leaving, I'd remember how he held me that first year, whispering that I was the only person who really understood him, and I clung to that lie because it was easier than admitting I'd built my life on a foundation that could never hold me up. One night last winter, I stood in the kitchen staring at the floor, listening to him rage about a towel I'd left on the bathroom counter. His words blurred into a dull roar in my ears. I remember thinking, if this is love, I don't want it anymore. That was the first time I felt the seed of something dangerous, clarity. I started seeing a therapist without telling him. For months, I drove to her little office tucked behind a bookstore, and I sat in the same chair week after week, unwinding all the ways I'd disappeared inside my marriage. "It's not your fault," she told me over and over. And maybe, for the first time in my life, I believed it. When Eleanor called, it felt like the universe confirming what I'd already decided. She never liked to meddle, but she'd seen what her son had become. "Julia," she said, her voice trembling just enough to tell me how hard this was for her. "I know you've tried. You have always tried. But sometimes, trying isn't enough. Sometimes, leaving is the bravest thing you can do." After that call, I didn't look back. I called a lawyer. I made copies of every document. I packed a small bag and left it hidden in the back of my car, just in case. The day I picked up the envelope from the lawyer's office, my hands were steady. It felt like holding a key to a door I'd always been afraid to open. And tonight, our anniversary, I finally turned that key. Watching Andrew's face when I slid the envelope across the table, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Relief. It still amazes me how you can build an entire plan while pretending nothing has changed. For weeks, I moved through our house like a ghost, rehearsing lines no one else could hear. Andrew would glance up from his laptop, too wrapped up in whatever crisis he was stewing over to notice the woman across from him was already gone in every way that mattered. I learned how to keep secrets out of necessity, not malice. Every appointment with my lawyer, every document I gathered, was another small rebellion against the life I'd been forced to shrink myself into. The first time I visited the lawyer, I couldn't stop my hands from shaking. He looked at me kindly over his polished oak desk and asked, "Are you sure?" It struck me how few people had ever asked me what I wanted, not what I could tolerate or what would keep the peace, but what I truly wanted. I took a deep breath. Yes, I'm sure. We spent hours going over details, the house, the accounts, the things I'd contributed that Andrew pretended were his alone. For years, he'd insisted everything was his money, his success, his life that I was simply allowed to orbit. But the truth sat right there in black and white. My name was on every mortgage, every savings account, every line of credit he thought I couldn't possibly understand. I started to feel something close to power again, At night, when he fell asleep, I'd lie awake in the dark, my mind sifting through every moment that had led me here. The little humiliations, the grand apologies that never lasted, the times he'd grabbed my arm too hard or raised his voice just enough to make me flinch. One evening, I stayed late at work, telling myself I needed to catch up on emails. But really, I just couldn't stand to walk into that house and pretend for one more minute. As I sat at my desk staring into the dark parking lot, my phone buzzed. It was Eleanor. "I know it's not my place," she began softly, "but if you ever need help, anything at all, please don't hesitate." I pressed the phone to my ear and closed my eyes. "Thank you," I whispered. The next day, I rented a small storage unit under my maiden name. I moved boxes there, old photos, the books I loved that he mocked, the heirlooms I refused to leave behind. I started thinking of it as my escape hatch, a secret space that belonged only to me. In the weeks leading up to our anniversary, Andrew seemed to sense something had shifted. He would look at me a little too long across the dinner table, his brow furrowed like he couldn't decide whether to question me or ignore the feeling. "Is there something you want to tell me?" he asked one night, his voice almost gentle. I studied him, wondering what might have become of us if he'd ever meant that softness. But I knew better by then. "No," I said calmly, "nothing you'd listen to." That was the closest I came to telling him I was already gone. The morning of our anniversary, I woke before dawn. I slipped out of bed and stood by the window as the sun rose, painting everything gold and pink. I thought about the woman I used to be, the girl who would have done anything to keep the peace, and I felt nothing but gratitude that she was gone. I dressed slowly, savoring every detail. The dress I chose was a soft blue, the same shade he once said made me look forgettable. The irony made me smile. I slid the envelope into my purse and zipped it shut. That evening, as we drove to the restaurant in silence, I felt lighter than I'd felt in years. I knew he thought I was planning some dramatic reconciliation, some apology for the distance that had grown between us. He still believed it was my job to mend everything. But tonight, I wouldn't be mending anything. Tonight, I was ending it. The restaurant was one of those places where everything gleamed. Polished silver, white linens, the soft glow of candles flickering against the windows. A place meant for celebrations, for anniversaries marked by laughter and toasts. I remember thinking how strange it was to sit there across from the man I once believed would be my whole life, knowing I was about to dismantle the last illusions between us. Andrew had spent most of the drive scrolling through emails on his phone, only glancing at me to sigh dramatically when I didn't speak. He liked to pretend he was too important to bother with trivial things like conversation. When the waiter led us to our table, Andrew gave him a curt nod and ordered a bottle of wine before we even sat down. I wondered if he could feel it, the distance between us widening into something too vast to bridge. 10 years, he said after the waiter left, swirling his glass as if the moment bored him. Who would have thought we'd make it this long? He said it like an insult wrapped in a compliment. I didn't answer. He leaned forward, his mouth curling into a smile that never reached his eyes. I suppose you're expecting some big speech, an apology for whatever you've decided I did wrong this time. I folded my hands in my lap. No speech. He raised an eyebrow. That's new. No passive-aggressive remarks, no tears. A warmth bloomed in my chest that surprised me. It was relief. I didn't have to pretend anymore. I looked around the room at the couples leaning into each other, at the old man kissing his wife's knuckles. For a moment, I felt something like mourning. Not for him, but for the girl I used to be. The one who would have given anything to keep him happy. He let out a disgusted huff. You really can't help yourself, can you? Even tonight, you ruin everything. The words hung between us, heavier than the chandelier overhead, but they didn't land the way he expected. I felt nothing but clarity. I reached into my purse, wrapped my fingers around the envelope, and drew it out. My hand didn't shake. My heart didn't stutter. I placed it on the table beside the flickering candle. He stared at it like it was a dead animal. "What the hell is this?" I didn't rush. I smoothed the napkin across my lap, savoring the calm. "It's what comes after you say the same thing one too many times," I said quietly. His nostrils flared. "Don't be ridiculous, Julia." He reached for the envelope. "You're overreacting, as usual." I caught his wrist before he could grab it. The contact startled him. I'd never stopped him before. I leaned in so only he could hear. "Read it." He yanked his hand back like I'd burned him. He tore open the envelope and scanned the first page. His face blanched. "You can't be serious," he hissed. I sat back in my chair, feeling taller than I ever had in his presence. I'm done. This is my line in the sand. A hush spread through the restaurant. Diners were openly staring now, forks paused halfway to their mouths. I didn't care. Let them watch. Let them see what it looks like when a woman stops apologizing for existing. Andrew's jaw worked, his eyes darting to the corners of the room like he was searching for someone to save him from this moment. And then, as if conjured by his desperation, Eleanor rose from her table a few feet away. She'd been sitting there all along, her posture straight, her expression unreadable. He stared at her, his mouth falling open. "Mother!" She held up a hand to silence him. A beat of silence stretched so taut I thought the air might split. And then, softly at first, then louder, she began to applaud. 1, 2, 3 measured claps that shattered the last pretense holding our marriage together. Around us, the restaurant erupted in hushed murmurs. Eleanor's eyes found mine across the candlelit space, and for the first time in years, I saw someone looking at me with pride instead of pity. I don't know if I'll ever forget the look on Andrew's face when Eleanor's applause cut through the silence. He looked like a child caught doing something unspeakable, his mouth opening and closing without a single word forming. The clapping didn't last long, just long enough to draw every eye in the room. But in that small, echoing moment, it was as if the balance of power shifted and settled somewhere it had always belonged. With a final decisive clap, Eleanor lowered her hands and took a slow step closer to our table. She didn't look at her son. Her gaze was locked on me. "Julia," she said, her voice calm but carrying, "I have never been prouder of you than I am right now." I swallowed, feeling something tight and knotted inside my chest loosen. Andrew shot to his feet. "Mother, sit down," he hissed. "This is not your concern." Her eyes flicked to him, and he actually flinched. "Sit down," she said, in the same unruffled tone she'd used when he was a boy, caught lying about broken windows. And to my astonishment, he did. He sank into his chair, pale and furious, while she stood beside me, her hand resting lightly on the back of my chair. "You have spent 10 years trying to be everything to everyone," she said, her voice softer now, "just for me. And I watched you disappear by inches. That's over." Tears blurred my vision. I blinked them away. I wouldn't let him see me cry, not tonight. Eleanor glanced down at the divorce papers splayed across the linen tablecloth, then back at me. "If you need anything at all, you call me. Do you understand?" Andrew let out a strangled laugh, but it was brittle, unraveling at the edges. "You're taking her side? She's leaving your son." Eleanor didn't look at him. She kept her eyes on mine. "I'm standing with the person who had the courage to end this charade." A hush swept over the restaurant again. I felt dozens of strangers witnessing something I hadn't known I needed. Someone, anyone, acknowledging how hard I had tried and how brave it was to stop trying. Andrew's face was turning a mottled red. He opened his mouth, no doubt to unleash some last barrage of cruelty, but Eleanor's hand lifted an inch and he went silent. I realized then how much of her own life she must have spent swallowing her pride for the sake of this man, how she'd probably taught herself the same lesson I had believed, that a woman's worth was measured by how much she could endure. I stood up slowly. My knees didn't wobble. My voice didn't catch. "I'm not coming home tonight," I said evenly. "I don't know if I'll ever come back." Andrew's eyes narrowed to slits. "And you think she's going to save you? She's as much to blame for this as you are." Eleanor's jaw tightened, but she didn't rise to the bait. I slipped my purse over my shoulder, feeling weightless. "You're right," I said. "She won't save me, because I don't need saving anymore." A murmur rose around us as I stepped away from the table. Eleanor moved aside to let me pass, then reached for my hand. Her palm was warm, steady. "You are stronger than he will ever understand," she whispered. And then, in front of everyone, she did something I never expected. She pulled me gently into an embrace. For one heartbeat, I rested my cheek against her shoulder, and in that small, quiet space, I felt decades of shame and fear begin to evaporate. When I finally stepped back, she nodded once, a silent benediction, and returned to her own table. Andrew stared after me, stunned into silence. I didn't look back again. The night air outside the restaurant felt cleaner than I remembered. I pulled my coat tighter around my shoulders and let my feet carry me across the parking lot, each step lighter than the last. I didn't check to see if Andrew followed me. I knew he wouldn't. He would stay behind, seething, calculating, trying to twist this into another story where he was the victim. For so long, I'd believed leaving would feel like failure. But as I slid into my car and shut the door, I felt something closer to relief than I had ever thought possible. I sat there for a moment, just breathing. My reflection in the rearview mirror looked different somehow, a woman who had stopped apologizing. My phone buzzed in my bag. Once that would have sent a jolt of panic through me, another demand, another accusation. But tonight I let it ring, and when it stopped, I exhaled. I thought about where to go. The house felt tainted by too many memories to spend another night there. But then I remembered the small guest house Eleanor had offered, the key she had pressed into my hand weeks ago, just in case. I started the engine and drove through quiet streets until I pulled into her driveway. A lamp glowed in the window of the little guest cottage. She must have known I would come. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The space was simple. Just a small kitchen, a sofa, a bed neatly made, but it felt like a sanctuary. I dropped my purse on the table and kicked off my shoes. For the first time in years, I didn't have to listen for footsteps in the hall. No one was going to shout my name or demand to know where I'd been. I stood in the middle of the room, feeling the quiet settle into my bones. And then, all at once, the tears came. Not the silent tears I'd shed in the shower or the ones I'd blinked away in public. These were hot, heaving sobs that tore their way out of me like an exorcism. I sank onto the edge of the bed, pressing my hand to my mouth to muffle the sound, but no one was there to hear me anyway. When the storm passed, I felt emptied out in the best possible way. My phone lit up again, the screen filled with unread messages. "Andrew, you're overreacting. Andrew, come home now. Andrew, this is ridiculous. Andrew, you'll regret this. And finally, Andrew, I'm telling everyone you're unstable." I scrolled past them all. My thumb hovered over his name, and without hesitation, I pressed block. A quiet finality settled over me. I washed my face in the little bathroom and changed into the soft cotton pajamas Eleanor had left folded at the foot of the bed. It felt strange and beautiful to slip into clothes no one had an opinion about. When I crawled beneath the covers, I realized my body was exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with the hour. It was the fatigue of 10 years spent contorting myself into something smaller than I was ever meant to be. I closed my eyes, and for the first time in as long as I could remember, I didn't fall asleep planning how to fix everything. Instead, I drifted off, wondering what it might feel like to build a life where I never again had to apologize for taking up space. 3 weeks passed before I set foot in my old house again. The day I returned was bright and cold, the kind of crisp morning that made everything feel newly washed. I parked at the curb and sat in the car a long time, staring up at the familiar brick facade. It looked exactly the same, and yet I felt nothing. No longing, no regret. I walked up the front steps, the key heavy in my pocket. When I pushed open the door, the silence that greeted me was the same I'd once dreaded. Now it felt neutral, like the echo of a chapter that had finally ended. The dining table was still set from the last dinner we'd eaten together. The plates had been cleared, but a wine glass stood near the place where he had sat, smudged by his fingerprints. I picked it up and set it in the sink without ceremony. I moved from room to room, gathering what I had come for. The photo albums from my grandmother, the books I loved, the small paintings I'd bought in college before I knew what it was to compromise your taste for someone else's approval. I left behind the furniture he'd insisted on choosing, the art he claimed was more sophisticated, the wedding china we'd never really used. When I reached the bedroom, I paused at the threshold. The bed was stripped, the mattress bare. A note lay in the center, scrawled in his tight, slanting handwriting. This house was never a home because you wouldn't let it be. I read it once, then I crumpled it in my fist and dropped it in the trash. It wasn't my job anymore to untangle his delusions. I finished packing my boxes, loaded them into the car, and locked the door behind me. As I turned away, a breeze lifted the hair from my shoulders, and I felt lighter than I had in years. Back at Eleanor's guest house, I set the boxes down and looked around the little living room that had become my refuge. A pot of tea waited on the counter. A small envelope rested beside it with my name written in Eleanor's steady hand. Inside was a note. Julia, I hope you know you've done something brave. Proud doesn't begin to cover it. Eleanor. Tears pricked my eyes, but this time they were soft, clean tears. I tucked the note into my pocket like a charm. That evening, I brewed the tea and sat by the window, watching the sun sink behind the trees. My phone was silent now, Andrew's last desperate messages trailing into nothing. I thought about the woman I used to be, the girl who thought love was something you earned through sacrifice, and I felt a tenderness for her, even if I no longer recognized her. Tomorrow, I would look for my own place. A small apartment maybe, with bright windows and no one's voice filling the rooms but mine. Tomorrow I would begin again. As the stars emerged, I whispered a promise to myself. Never again would I trade my peace for someone else's comfort. I closed my eyes, and for the first time in over a decade, I slept without dreaming of escape.